thank you, Paolo, Angelica, and Joy, for joining me today. We really wanted to make this a conversation about leadership. And I'll just start out by saying, like, today kind of felt like one of those challenging moments of leadership, right? I come into the screen and I've got blurry screen, and I've been using this camera like a bazillion times. In fact, Angelica and I were on a panel yesterday and it worked just fine. Same location, same everything. So like sometimes leadership is a challenging moment day by day, which is kind of what this has felt like. And that is the lowest of the challenges that we're going to have today. Like, you just kind of got to roll with it. Some of the things that we thought were really big deals before have become not such big deals. And some things that we thought were immovable have become really movable in this moment in time. And so I'm gonna kick us off today with just talking to each of our panelists, having them give you a landscape view of what's happening in their state. We have a variety of states in terms of like which schools are open, how they're handling protocols, what kind of things that they're challenging. And so I'm gonna start with you, Joy, just to give us kind of a landscape view of what's going on in Oklahoma, and then I'll follow with Paolo and Angelica, and then we'll get into some questions about leadership. And I'd invite the audience at any time that you want to throw in questions. We really would like to make this interactive about some of the challenges that we're seeing and the things that we're going into. Joy, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about what we're all learning. And my name is Joy Hofmeister. I'm the elected state chief in Oklahoma, the state superintendent of public instruction. We have, as of today, a daily or 78 cases per 100,000. That is based on our state health officials on underreporting of what they believe the number actually is. So we do have spread, as we know many states do. Last week, the White House task force rated Oklahoma as one of the higher states with spread. I think we were 7th highest. So that's kind of the landscape with COVID. When it comes to how we are delivering instruction, most of our schools have started in person. We had some of our metro area, urban areas, where they started with a in-person and are gradually opening up. But I would say because of quarantining, because of spread, because of the lack of bus drivers and those staff that are key to being able to open a building, we are seeing a lot of our schools having to be closed or move into out of in-person and into full distance learning, or a combination with A/B schedules. So that's just a little bit. We're just all rolling with it and doing everything we can to get our kids into meaningful instruction, but it's quite a challenge.
Thanks, Joy. Paolo, you want to give us a landscape of Ohio?
Sure. I'm Paolo DeMaria, State Superintendent in Ohio. I am appointed by a 19-member State Board of Education, have been the superintendent here for about 4.5 years. You're probably likely to hear the same story. We were one of the first states to sort of shut down schools across the board back in March. At a time when we knew very little about this COVID thing and what it actually meant. I think our governor showed great leadership and continues to show great leadership to this day. The state developed a sort of a color-coded alert system map that shows different condition levels by county. That process has served us well and has also been important to school districts, many of whom spent, an intensive time over the summer planning for what reopening was going to look like, and doing a lot of sort of contingency planning about, well, what if this happens and what if that happens? My rhetoric mostly in the late spring and early summer was, surely by November, by December, we'll have clarity, we'll understand what's happening, and yet we find ourselves now with even murkier situation. The response to the governor's actions in the spring were, in fact, to flatten the curve. We had a little bit of a spike then in the summer, and now we're sort of on a very significant upward swing as well as are most of the states. And the color coded system, when it might have had one or two counties in red status and no counties in purple status, purple being sort of the highest level, we now have almost every county is in red status, and I think we're up to 4 counties that are in purple status. Similar to what Joy described in Oklahoma at the start of the year, we had we actually publish a map that you can find on our website by district about the reopening model that they are currently using. And as you might have imagined, in our concentrated urban areas, you found more likelihood where people started in a very remote way, almost full remote, across the enterprise, to our more rural areas that had not seen very much incidence in terms of COVID, being fully, 5 days back, full time, face-to-face learning. And we've watched that map sort of morph over time. In some ways, the remote learning areas have reopened into hybrid models or maybe even full return models. But now as things have gotten worse, we're starting to see, some of those fully opened places go to hybrid. Sometimes that's a cause more of staffing. The adults are getting sick, staffs are being quarantined, and so they just can't manage 5 full days of return, or they're trying to help reduce conditions in their communities, and they're varying between different approaches. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of rethinking as county statuses change. People are having board meetings and deciding, well, we better do this. In fact, Dayton announced that they're just going to suspend educational activities through the first or second week of January, so that by that point, hoping to have greater certainty. So, all this in the context of all the other things, sports and assessments and all these things that are happening that we have to wrestle with.
Yeah. Angelica, in the last week, Rhode Island has made some tough decisions about the state, but also about what they're going to do about education. Do you want to share that?
Sure. So we are taking a 2-week pause in the state of Rhode Island, but not in schools. The only thing that we have done for high schools is give them the flexibility to go to their limited plan. So like you heard in the prior states, our districts, our LEA had to create plans for full in-person, partial in-person, limited in-person. We had no district, we announced that we were going to go full in-person, period. We took a whole state approach around this. And, we also have the municipality data. We had 5 measures for how we were going to open up schools, who was going to open up. We only had 2 districts that were going to open up partial. Which meant kind of an A-B day for high school, but we prioritized 9th grade, all our multilingual learners, all our differently abled students, and all the transitional grades. But everyone, our entire state is basically back in person. And what we did was that actually in the urbans, we had them come back. It's where we've had the highest concentration of students come back. For many reasons. Parents wanted them back. We've gave parents the option of virtual or in person. Most of our parents want their kids to be back in person. Our numbers, like everywhere else, is rising right now. But our main goal and the goal of the governor and my office is that we will continue to keep schools open as much as we can, because it has proven to be the safest place. So we have a K-12 testing system that it's only for educators, students, and their families, where they get their testing and it gets expedited. And we created something called the EDOC, which is the Educational Operations Center with the National Guard, with the Department of Health in my office. And we deploy people out to districts. We do training. We inspected the schools in terms of airflow, like all of those nice things that we were all trained to do. But this is where we are, right? It's flexibility. We're all learning, and we're being pretty aggressive about it, because we also have data of kids and teachers that are virtual as in person, and the percentage of positive cases in virtual is much higher than our in person. So we know that in person is a safe place, and this pause that we have now in the state is to maintain our schools open. We have closed everything else down so that schools can continue to be a safe space for everyone involved. We are doing some testing today, pilot asymptomatic testing in schools in our high density areas, so that we can see what it looks like. And so far from what we've done today, we can see that the numbers in the community and the schools don't match. The numbers in the schools are much lower. And like what we heard prior, in the places that we've had to close down schools, not because the Department of Health has decided that they need to close down schools, it's because we didn't have the staff members, because we have greater challenges with staff members congregating outside of the school building than we do with students and families. So I think that that's a challenge. But what we did do is we have hired subs statewide and trained them to go out to all our LEAs, because we're doing everything in our power to make sure that kids continue to go to school in person.
Yeah. I want to just punctuate that, because I think there is a narrative that people are not trying to get back into school, and writ large, what we hear from all of you and from most chiefs is that that's the leadership moment. That's the moment of trying to find every way possible. And whether it's through staging certain groups to get back into schools, younger kids, for example, who really need it, students with disabilities, English language learners, those students who are most at risk, trying to find ways to stage those kinds of students back into schools first, and then, expanding from there. And in many cases, many of you have fully open schools and have just put in like really strict protocols to make sure that it's a safe place. And so I know through our conversations and our Wednesday chief calls, we talk about that a lot, and just want to say that that's one of the challenges in leadership. So let me ask you all, because this is like lessons in leadership. And I think the reason we put this panel forward was because we know that everyone listening also is going to have their own set of leadership challenges in this pandemic. We know that our partners in districts, in the legislature, in health departments, at other state agencies, all of them have to make forced choices in some of these cases. And so let me ask you to think back to last January and think about what were the things that you thought were most challenging. I know you're smiling. It's like, oh, what a lovely time, January. What you thought were your biggest challenges as a leader, and how you would describe what your biggest challenges are today, and how you approach that as a leader. So I'll open it up for whoever would like to start.
So I'll go first. One of the things I've been trying to do, and I would argue I was doing this back in January, was when I became superintendent, I saw that the agency was largely in a reactive mode, and in fact the education community by and large was reacting to things. And so, my strategy was I really want to pivot and put us in a position where we're being much more proactive and thinking ahead, and laying the groundwork for what we want to become, what we want to do, rather than sort of defending this or defending that and what have you. The development of our strategic plan, Each Child, Our Future, was really essential to that. And so we, and that took place about a couple of years ago. So we had a number of initiatives that were underway to kind of continue to drive us in a very proactive way moving forward. We had just put together a study group on the experience and educational outcomes for students with disabilities. That group was starting to meet to really kind of dig into the challenges that students with disabilities face. We had a little high school redesign task force working away, some things that were really designed to kind of push the system and think about what might the future look like. And then then come March, everything that it was the total opposite of proactivity. You were now full bore into reactive stuff. You weren't thinking about the what could be's. You were thinking about sort of the day-to-day tactical, technical, how do we feed students, how do we give clear guidance about taking attendance and continuity of education, what resources were available, how do you deal with a district that had no broadband and no cell phone service because they're in the middle of rural Ohio, to urban areas that couldn't find students and couldn't figure out how to what platform to use to best engage, and and just issuing reams of advice documents, information documents, lots of communication. Not that there wasn't a lot of communication before, but just amped up in a way and very focused on the tactical and the immediate. So I'll leave that as initial reactions.
Thanks, Paolo. It is kind of hard to stay focused on the big picture when the day-to-day moments, and I don't know that we've ever been in a situation. We early on talked about, hurricanes, various weather-related things, but there were so many different things. Those things had a finite amount of space in that. There were places students could go. There were opportunities that you just don't have in this situation. And it's not to dismiss that a hurricane or a tornado or any of those kinds of things are not anything but horrible. But this had its whole level of problems in and of itself that we just couldn't use some of those kinds of situations. So, Joy, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah. I was going to say, as you framed that question, what were our priorities, or what were we doing in January, and how has that shifted and changed? And I love the way that's been expressed, from being more proactive, and you had that opportunity to plan ahead. And when the pandemic came, it really was a time where we had to, it was the test of the strength of relationships that had been built over time. Thank goodness we had various advisory councils and that met on a regular basis to be able to quickly lean on stakeholder groups, whether those were superintendents or teachers or parents or various other groups. And yet I would also say that the lesson for me, kind of looking at the arc of this experience and leading through that, has been that the higher the stakes of decisions, the more frequent the communication had to be. And what we used to have, where there was a quarterly meeting or a monthly superintendent advisory, turned into all districts, limited to 2. We have 540 districts in Oklahoma. So we had a Zoom call with over 1,100 on it. And it happened 3 times, basically every other day during the week, as we started into that spring break, the decision to do a closure. And what would that mean in terms of all those things that we are accustomed to needing to occur in the spring, and various regulations, and how would we respond to those, but really listening, being able to absorb those questions and turn them into the kind of specificity that people need in a time of crisis to be able to act, and to try to close the space between that don't know what to do, don't have the answers, to we're ready to then move. And we also saw later, as we eased up on that at the end of the school year and said, all right, here's a model framework for Return to Learn Oklahoma, and now you do yours, just like Angelica was mentioning, how each school was to be prepared with those different, modality. And we let that go back to the districts, and we then saw each of them still leaning on one another. But we also saw, not just with those we serve, with those we regulate, with those that we are to be in a direct leadership position with, strengthened, but more so between agencies, having that regular every week, and sometimes multiple times during the week, close conversations with our State Department of Health, for example, with DHS, with those mental health, those areas where we were meeting, but not regularly in terms of every single week, with standing meetings. Those are some of the changes that have occurred that I hope we continue, maybe not with the same frequency, but we've learned a lot of lessons.
Seriously.
Yeah, there's some good things about that, right? I just want to punctuate a couple of things you said, which is like the strength of relationships. And this summer we spent some time with Ron Heifetz and talking about adaptive leadership and how adaptive leadership, and even in moments of not crisis, it really relies upon those relationships and bringing people along. And in this moment, I think has punctuated that. And then also just how frequently the information was changing.
Yeah.
I think that had to be one of the most frustrating things that I heard from you all, and we discussed over and over again, like on a daily basis. It was like, and here's another thing, but we'll get into that. And Angelica, I'd love for you to kind of reflect on how do you're in an environment where the information continues to change, and how do you keep people trusting that the information you're giving them is moving them in that direction? Along with some of these other challenges.
Yeah, I agree with everything that has been said, because it's almost as you're saying, I'm like, yep, checking off those boxes. But when you started off the conversation saying January, I can't even imagine what I was thinking in January. It almost feels like 10 years ago, right? But
Right.
Priorities are still the same, right? We still had priorities on having green curriculum, standard bearing curriculum, like all those things haven't gone away. The crazy part is that work has continued. All the work that we were doing has continued, and now we have COVID, right? Now it's like on top of everything else, now it's COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And having those relationships were really important for us. But it was also kind of, all right, this is a moment for us to step up to the plate. We were one of the first, if not the second state, that had a case in the United States. We had the first case in February, and it was a school case. It was a school that came back from Italy. So we experienced this very early on, which was a blessing in many respects, because we already had rubrics for how to do distance learning. That's something that we had already in our state. And then we spent the 2 weeks of February, making sure that districts had a plan for distance learning. So when we closed March 13th, districts already had a plan, and we gave them a week off. We took the calendar, gave everybody that week off, and we said, okay, finalize your plan. So that was already in the works. So it gave us a little bit of a leg up. A week feels like a leg up in this day and age. So, and what it also taught me was that the parameters that we have, we are sort of self-imposed. And I'll tell you what that means. My first case was in a parochial school, but they shared a bus with the public school. So now I have a positive case in a parochial school that now is with 30 kids that go to one of my public schools. So now we have this widespread situation. So like Joy mentioned, those calls were happening every single day, but I included parochial, independent schools, charters. It was everyone. Everyone that touched education in the state of Rhode Island was on those calls. So I don't oversee private schools, but now I have a standing meeting with them, and we follow the same calendar. We follow the same PD. We follow the same decisions that are being made. We made it a whole state approach, where if there's a child, then that's where we're going to be. That's the space that we're going to be in. And that's where we're going to lead from. And that's different. That's different for me. That's different for many of us.
Yeah.
But there was no other way to do it, because you have a child that goes to public school and a sibling that might go to a parochial school.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very intertwined world. And the partnerships with the Department of Health, we did not work closely with the Department of Health prior to this, I have to say. And now every single decision we make together. And I'm not going to sit here and say that has been easy, because it has not been. Right? Especially with a high tense, and in education, everything for us is very critical. And when you're used to dealing with health, they take a different type of approach to it. And when they would say, okay, this is how we're going to roll it out, I was like, no, that is not how we're going to roll it out, because in my world, this means that. And they're like, oh, I was like, no. Communication is really important, and understanding how to be bilingual meaning education world, health world. Just how do you navigate all these contexts? And the language matters. It really does. And so it's really learning and being flexible. I've worked really closely with my governor. We do a lot of press conferences. And my word for the state of Rhode Island is flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. And be kind, right?
Yeah.
That's hard in the time of crisis.
I'm going to come back to the partnership. You guys have all talked about partnerships, and we talk about them regularly about, departments of health, your epidemiologists, a variety of other agencies in your state. And this point about community that you raise, Angelica, I think is one that, maybe that's something as a leader I've learned. Like I intuitively knew that it's a community, meaning big tent, like everybody in the community, but in education, we kind of put things in boxes, or we just expect the school to handle everything. And there was a point where we were on a call and we were talking about the distribution of testing across the state, and chiefs were like, time out. Like, we need our health people in this. It can't just be all education. And I think that was one of the leadership lessons that I heard, a variety of us talk about. I want to ask you guys both about partnerships and how you've evolved those and how you worked on them, but also, like, you've been with your fellow chiefs probably more now than we've ever been. We do a lot more calls. We do a lot more talking, because we're sharing ideas back and forth. And I would love for you to reflect on something that you learned from a colleague or took from a colleague that helped you through the pandemic.
I just want to mention that in the early days, that was, back in the spring, we were learning from one another when it came to some of the logistical scenarios of, how do we ensure that child nutrition continues for all of our kids, even though we have buildings closed? That's one example. But I would also say that another thing that I always learn from our fellow education chiefs, and thank goodness, under your leadership, Carissa, we've had this ability to be tethered together with a weekly Zoom opportunity where it's just us, and we're able to kind of compare notes and learn about what's happening in some of the states, and then try to see how that might flesh out in our own. That's been a real important thing, even if there's just a handful on that call. But I think it also makes me think about all those we haven't yet really included in this pandemic. And for me, our legislators are embedded in their communities. We will get text messages, hey, heard about this, or tell me about this, or what, I think that early on, I don't think I included our legislators as much as we really could have. They needed to also know information as it's coming out, and including them on distribution of that kind of those resources that we were just like churning out, and they were constantly growing FAQs on what to do, and science is still investigating COVID. It's all happening in real time. So this is all something that I think like all walking along together is so much more efficient than trying to play catch up and bring people in later. And so this is one of those lessons for me that is a takeaway that we want to continue to expand that network to include those who have a true vested interest representing their communities in our elected government.
Thanks, Joy.
Yeah, well, I'll chime in. I have to say, Carissa, that I've learned from my colleagues how to take a breath. There have been days that I would come to your meetings and I was just like, oh my gosh, I have this, I have that. And somebody would say, well, what do you do to take care of you? I think people forget that we're human beings too. And And I know that everybody has different agendas, and, just the word being kind, being selfless, and just how do you, yeah, all these things that are happening, I'm learning too. I'm trying to do the best I can. How do we work together? And I think that has really been important. The sense of community that has happened nationwide has been important, even if not everyone's there. And from your meetings, the New England Chiefs, we've created our own meeting. We meet Thursday mornings at 7:30 in the morning to talk about what's happening in our neck of the woods, because New England is very different, and I'm new to New England, and our borders bleed into one another, right? Like it's what one does impacts the other. So we become very united. In education, at times it's very competitive, very closed door, but that has changed. We're all trying to figure this out. And if somebody has something, can I borrow it? Can you do this? Here's what I did. I think there's a lot more of that now than there was before.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing that I would say that I've learned, and I've listened to other chiefs, is it's really the power of the media, right? I think that has been very, very, I think we haven't harnessed that in a way that we could have in the past. Because I'm looking at where we're going to go moving forward. And people that say that they care, that they want to be a part of it, well, where are you, right? Like, where are you? And putting things down on paper, all the guidance in the world, all these handbooks, all these manuals mean nothing if people don't know how to actually implement them, right? I can't tell you how many times we're talking about what parents need to know. And it's not just translating a document. It's really talking to that community in a language that they can understand and in a medium that they can understand, and understanding that. The Latino community here doesn't watch television as much. They do radio. So how do you really understand communities and work within the community? So those are some of the lessons that I've learned talking with other chiefs and figuring out how we pool resources. Because right now is not a time where we have resources. And if we have the resources, we just don't have the staff, right? Like we can't crank it out fast enough.
Yeah, absolutely. Paolo.
Yeah, so for me, always with an eye to the future, a lot of it had to do with remote learning, and everything from the technical connectivity issues. What were innovative approaches states were taking in terms of deploying technology, helping inspire connectivity or deal with connectivity shortages or student engagement or what have you, to the actual remote learning tools, training for teachers, those kinds of things. Because I think one of the things we're going to come out of this with is the sense that the use of technology in the educational experience is here to stay. The challenge is, how do we use it effectively? How do we identify which students are likely to benefit from it more? How do we then acknowledge that some students aren't really cut out for it? And what does that mean? And what does it mean for personalized and customized approaches to education? So really, listening carefully to the other 50 chiefs and their experiences and their thinking and what was happening in their states, and watching their policies, because along with that then comes all the policies around absence and counting seat time, and is seat time really a thing anymore, which there's another section on that later in the week. All these different ideas that begin to kind of erode away at sort of our paradigm for delivering education, and really call for some future oriented rethinking of some of these fundamental mechanisms. But in the meantime, we kind of have to come up with the practical realities of, okay, you're in remote status, how are you counting students for attendance purposes? How are you dealing with absences? How are you tracking down students that aren't engaging, and what does that look like? And then how do you create the conditions that allow people to do the things that they know are right in the context of their own communities, their own partnerships, and what have you? So.
Yeah, I want to give you guys a moment to tell us a story about something that you're most proud of during this time, and it can be about your team or someone that you saw doing something. Because I think it's we can spend a lot of time thinking about what's not going right now, but I want to give you that. I also want to invite our audience. We're at the last 15 minutes of our session, and we'd invite any questions that you'd like to put in the chat for us if you have any questions for our chiefs. And Angelica, I'm going to start with you. Any particular bright spot you'd like to share with us?
So there are two that I think, this EDOC that I mentioned earlier, the fact that we were able to get the National Guard, the Department of Health, DHS, everybody in one room, and that's all that they're doing. These people are deployed, and this is what they're doing to educate, to mitigate. We have over 60 phone lines where people are answering and just real time. I didn't think that the Department of Education could do that. We're not built to do something like that. So it's a new form of leadership, right? It's a new form of rallying and bringing everyone together because we are the leaders and we put it together. So I'm really proud of that. It was hard, but it's a bright spot. I think the second piece that I'm really proud of is how my team is working in terms of looking towards the future, reimagining what schools are going to be like moving forward. And I think that's really important for us because, the old cliche, never let a good crisis go to waste. We are definitely not letting that happen. We are really looking at what the high school experience has to be, how we can do things statewide, how we can break down these barriers of the higher performing schools and lower performing schools. How do we get kids to be in the same classes that would never have been in our rural and our urban? How are they, we actually did something this summer that we were able to measure. We created these online classes as a state for our high school students, middle school as well, and elementary, but designed by our high school students with professors and teachers. And we saw that every single student that attended these courses, their SAT scores went up an average of 500 points. So
Wow.
that's something that we could have never known was going to be the outcome. But we had kids that from urban, suburban, rural, all in one classroom, really debating really racial justice around history in a way that these kids would have never interacted before. So I'm looking forward to a whole new state education system where we are bringing people together, PD across the state. And, and I have to mention this, we created a statewide calendar, which just before I say that, there is local control here. Like every district has control, but what we did is that we said, okay, this is the statewide calendar we're going to follow, period. Everybody has to get on it, and everybody got on it. And what was exciting about that is that we embedded PD days into that. So we have 8 distance learning days already embedded. So we have to get better at what we're doing distance learning, but those are PD days that now the districts don't have to pay for, that are part of the education, what we value as a state. And no more snow days. So sorry, kids. So that's exciting for us, and only people where it snows understand how valuable those days are. Because
now it'll just be electrical storms. Sorry, the electricity is out.
Yeah.
Those will be the only thing we can hope for. So, Paolo, do you have some bright spots you want to share?
Yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about my staff, because I think the other thing people don't recognize is all of a sudden here I'm working to create the conditions for all my staff members to be successful, and then suddenly again the disruption occurred in our work as well. Everybody found themselves at home, many of them with children who, and having to manage those the realities of I've got a job, I've got a household obligation, I've got a child and an educational obligation. And so the team just pulled together in so many fantastic ways to be responsive, working together. I think we had a lot of skeptics among perhaps our management tier of staff about how teleworking was actually going to work out. But, without exception, they've all sort of, come over to the side of, hey, this is actually really creating a lot of strong connections, better communications, in some cases, increased productivity. We're getting more done. We've got better ideas being circulated. And that too will be challenging. We've had hiring freezes. So, staff have been stretched to the limit in terms of the work that they're doing. And we continue to, find ways, including simple things like at the start of a meeting, just letting people know, we know you've got obligations. If you have to deal with a child or another member of your household, don't hesitate to walk away. You don't have to apologize, do what you need to do, and somebody else will bring you up to speed. Looking at little things that we can do to be accommodative of those realities, and to, and Angelica made the point about flexibility. how do we be flexible so that the staff can create the conditions for them to just find the balance in their lives with all the obligations that they have, and that's been real important. So proud of my team, and it's taught us a number of things about the culture of the organization. We are actually doing some culture work through reading the culture code and just pushing ourselves to sort of say, how do we create a system and a place where people feel valued and they're free to give feedback, and we're open to pushing against each other in the interest of finding the best outcome. And we've really seen some of that manifest. More work ahead of us, of course, but it's been very inspiring to me and very proud.
Yeah, all those books that I've read about transforming work environments don't even touch like what we're dealing with now, and how it's changed the way I think about working and sharing a room with my college-age daughter. So all of that, right? Joy, what's some of the bright spots?
I think the bright spot remains just how inspired I am by our teachers as I hear story after story after story and seeing them in action. Our teachers moved heaven and earth without any notice last spring to keep connections with their students and with their families. And it continued with preparation for the fall, knowing that they were actually unsure if they were going to be going back to school in person or in distance learning, or what that roller coaster, as it has turned out to be, would unfold in front of them. And yet they came back. They signed contracts to come back without a lot of detail and understanding. And we have seen our teachers, as I am a part of different Facebook groups. We have one with 67,000 members, and one teacher will write how exhausted they feel, and there'll be 900 responses quickly. Yes, I feel it. It's like nothing they've ever had before. And I have a sister that is a teacher, and just hearing the stories of how stretched thin they feel, but they still find it within them to give more and more. And I never want to stop talking about that sacrifice that they are making. Some of them literally risking their own health to make these kinds of connections with students and to put others ahead of themselves. And we know teachers do that.
Yep.
It's in their blood. But to see them do that right now is truly inspiring to me. And then the last thing I would say is just the way the team here at the State Department of Education has been so adaptive and shift in the way they are trying to support our schools. One is a network of learning that we have around the virtual learning and distance learning, and how to do that and learn from one another and make it something so much more effective than where we were, of course, in the spring. And that connection of districts that are part of a cohort working together, studying the data, the evidence, the science behind what works, troubleshooting from technical areas to design issues, making plans for the future. That, again, is something that will carry us through this pandemic and on the other side, and I hope is a pole start to closing the digital divide in our state, so that that internet connectivity is as common as other basic utilities for every family. That kind of work, it truly inspires me.
Yeah. Well, we are almost at time. I'm going to ask you one last question in a rapid fire way. But before we do that, I have to say that I'm inspired by all of you. Being a part of the conversations with chiefs, and just knowing that, to Angelica's point, you work tirelessly, and I can't say that punctuated enough, because there were sometimes people got on the calls and I'm pretty sure they hadn't slept, right? And worried and worry all the time, and are just dedicated and focused on that. And so I just want to thank you all for doing that. The question I want to ask you in a quick soundbite, because we only got a couple of minutes left, is advice you give to a new leader coming into a role as a chief, or into a role where they have to lead in this new environment. You all have talked a lot about what the modern future looks like. What's your best advice to new leaders?
Mine is listen a lot, listen first, ask questions. That will always serve you well in any setting, and you almost can't do enough of it.
Thank you.
Mine is that you can't lead if no one's following, and you won't have anyone walking next to you or following behind you if there's not trust. And building the time in to learn perspectives of others will help inform the kinds of decisions we have to sometimes make on the fly. And I can't underscore enough how being able to be effective is only as good as the relationships that you have around you.
That's true.
I have to agree with all of that, but building trust is the most important, because whenever you make a decision, people will trust that you are making the decision in the best interest of the kids and the teachers that work within the system. So it's doing what you say you're going to do. And if you're not able to do what you said you're going to do, be open and transparent about it. Explain why. This is why I couldn't do this, and this is why I'm thinking this way. Just being very open and honest, and apologize when you make mistakes, right? And forgive yourself, because you're going to make many mistakes.
Yeah.
Forgive yourself.
Right. Get used to it.
That's a great way to end. Thank you all for your time with us today. We really appreciate you sharing your lessons learned. I hope it was a moment for you just to reflect. We're still in the midst and in the throes of really difficult decisions every day, and really just appreciate your leadership. So thank you, all three of you, for joining us today.
Thanks to you, Carissa.
And I want to thank you for all the support. We can't say it enough.
That's right.
Thank you.